Every evening at 7:43 p.m., Elena arranges 3 white roses in a crystal vase by her window, not because anyone will see them, not because she expects visitors. She does this because 2 years ago, a man who no longer remembers her name once mentioned that white roses reminded him of new beginnings. The ritual has become sacred, a prayer made of petals and crystal, performed for a god who has forgotten he ever existed. In the symbolic realm of her desire, Elena has constructed an entire cathedral of longing. The roses multiply, dozens, then hundreds, filling rooms that exist only in the architecture of her wanting. She walks through corridors lined with mirrors that reflect not her face, but his, sleeping peacefully beside her in a bed they've never shared, laughing at jokes she's rehearsed but never told, growing old in a future that lives only in her imagination. The air in this place smells of white roses and unfulfilled promises, thick as honey, sweet as delusion. Here, in this temple of female desire, she is both the worshipper and the worshipped, the architect and the offering. She has learned to feed herself on crumbs of attention, a liked photo, a casual text, the memory of how he looked at her once across a crowded room. Schopenhauer understood this. That desire is the engine of all suffering. But he perhaps missed how women transform their suffering into elaborate altars, how they make martyrs of themselves and call it love. The other women come to visit Elena's cathedral, friends who recognize the familiar ache, mothers who remember building their own temples, daughters who are just learning to lay the first stones. They bring their own offerings, screenshots of conversations, analyzed like ancient texts, horoscope readings that promise better days, Pinterest boards full of wedding dresses for marriages that will never happen. Together, they sustain the economy of hope, each woman's desire feeding and strengthening the others. But here's the terrible revelation that Elena cannot yet see. While she builds her cathedral of longing, he lives in a kingdom of indifference. Every rose she arranges, every scenario she imagines, every prayer she offers to his memory only increases his power over her. Her desire has made him a king without kingdom, a god without followers. Except for her, kneeling at an altar he doesn't know exists. The very intensity of her longing transforms him from an ordinary, flawed man into something mythic, unreachable, divine. The climax comes not with his return, but with Elena's recognition of the trade she has made. Standing in her imaginary cathedral, surrounded by the ghosts of all her unlived lives with him, she finally sees the bargain. Her boundless capacity for love exchanged for his boundless capacity to remain unmoved. Her desire has not brought them closer. It has erected a monument to distance itself. The ancients called it enchantment. Today, psychology names it limerence, that state of obsessive romantic attachment where every thought, every action, every dream revolves around another person who may barely acknowledge your existence. Coined by psychologist Dorothy Tennov in the 1970s, limerence manifests in our modern world through the endless checking of social media profiles, the analysis of every digital interaction, the construction of elaborate fantasies around minimal encouragement. We see it in the woman who interprets a work email as flirtation, the man who believes a casual conversation means eternal love, the endless cycle of hope and disappointment that dating apps have turned into a profitable industry. Through Schopenhauer's lens, limerence becomes even more sinister. It's the will's cruelest joke, convincing us that another person holds the key to our completeness. Schopenhauer would recognize Elena's cathedral as the will's masterpiece, a prison built from hope itself, where the bars are made of rose petals and the locks are forged from longing. The woman thinks she loves. The will knows she suffers, and in that suffering, she grants power to someone who has done nothing to earn it except exist in the right place at the right time to catch her desire like a virus. But here's what makes this power dynamic so insidious. It's completely invisible to the one who benefits from it. He goes about his life unaware that somewhere a woman has made him the center of her universe. Her desire asks nothing of him, no reciprocation, no acknowledgement, no effort. It is the perfect power, absolute and unconscious. Schopenhauer understood that the will operates through such deceptions, convincing us that our suffering serves some greater purpose when it serves only the endless, meaningless dance of desire and frustration. In your quietest moments, when the performance stops and the audience goes home, what altars have you built in the secret chambers of your heart? What cathedrals of longing do you tend with the devotion of a monk, offering prayers to gods who have forgotten your name? The most exquisite prisons are the ones we build for ourselves. Key by Golden Key. A successful businessman stares at his reflection in a boardroom window, seeing not himself but the ghost of expectations he can never escape. Marcus adjusts his tie for the 7th time this morning, the same Windsor knot his father taught him 30 years ago. The gesture has become involuntary, a nervous tic disguised as grooming, performed whenever he feels the familiar weight of judgment settling on his shoulders like an invisible cloak. In the symbolic landscape of inherited shame, Marcus lives in a house of mirrors where every reflection shows him falling short. The mirrors multiply endlessly: boardroom windows, bathroom surfaces, the black screen of his phone when it powers down, but none show his face. Instead, they reveal the phantom outline of his father's disappointment, a shadow that has learned to walk upright, to shake hands, to give presentations, to make love to his wife while thinking about quarterly projections and the sound of his father's sighs. The architecture of this shadow world is built from discarded masks, the ones Elena left behind in the previous tale, now scattered like fallen leaves across Marcus's landscape. He steps over them without recognition, too focused on the towering monument at the center of his realm, a statue of his father, carved not from stone, but from the accumulated weight of every "you could do better" and "when I was your age." The statue's eyes follow him everywhere, unblinking, eternal, in their quiet disapproval. Here, in this gallery of inherited expectations, Marcus curates his collection of achievements like artifacts in a museum dedicated to someone else's dreams. The corner office, the luxury car, the expensive watch, each piece carefully arranged not because he wants them, but because they form a protective barrier against the statue's gaze. He has become the curator of his own inadequacy, polishing trophies that feel hollow in his hands, while the phantom father nods with the satisfaction of a collector who has finally found the perfect specimen of disappointment. The other shadow children visit this museum regularly, men and women who recognize the familiar exhibition, who know the weight of invisible expectations pressing down like atmospheric pressure before a storm. They move through the halls with the careful steps of people walking on glass, sharing knowing glances, whispering about their own monuments, their own collections of hollow victories. Together, they sustain the economy of perpetual striving, each person's inadequacy feeding the other's need to prove themselves worthy of love they received conditionally, if at all. But Schopenhauer would recognize this shadow museum for what it truly is: another manifestation of the will's endless hunger, disguised as filial duty. The father's expectations were never about Marcus. They were the will expressing itself through generational transmission, ensuring that suffering passes from parent to child like a carefully preserved heirloom. Each generation polishing the pain until it gleams like a precious thing. The revelation comes when Marcus finally approaches his father's statue and sees the inscription at its base. In loving memory of the man I could have been. The statue crumbles, revealing not his father at all, but another shadow child, another museum curator, another man who spent his life arranging achievements for someone else's approval. The phantom father was never his father. It was his father's father, and his father's father's father, an endless regression of men trying to prove their worth to ghosts, who were themselves trying to prove their worth to other ghosts. The Greeks called it the sins of the fathers. Today, psychology names it intergenerational trauma, the unconscious transmission of emotional wounds, behavioral patterns, and unrealistic expectations from parent to child across multiple generations. First identified by researchers studying Holocaust survivors and their children, this phenomenon manifests in our modern world through workaholism disguised as ambition, perfectionism masked as excellence, and the persistent feeling that nothing we achieve is ever quite enough. We see it in the executive who cannot enjoy success, the artist who destroys their work before completion, the endless pursuit of external validation to fill internal voids carved by well-meaning parents who never learned to love themselves. Through Schopenhauer's philosophical lens, intergenerational trauma becomes the will's most sophisticated trap, a mechanism that ensures suffering perpetuates itself without conscious awareness. Schopenhauer would see Marcus's shadow museum as the will's gallery, where each generation believes they are healing the wounds of the past when they are actually preserving them, passing them down like precious artifacts to be cherished and maintained by the next curator of inadequacy. The will doesn't need to create new suffering when it can simply convince each generation to lovingly tend the suffering of their ancestors. The cruel genius of this system is that it disguises itself as love, as honor, as tradition. The father believes he is preparing his son for a harsh world. The son believes he is honoring his father's memory. Neither sees that they are both prisoners in the same cell, taking turns as guard and captive, while the will watches from beyond the bars, satisfied that its work continues without interruption. When you achieve something remarkable, whose approval do you seek first? The living or the dead? What monuments have you built to honor expectations that were never yours to fulfill? Some inheritances are too expensive to keep, no matter how long they've been in the family. A therapist sits in her office after hours, surrounded by the emotional debris of her clients' lives, slowly disappearing into the weight of others' suffering. Dr. Sarah Chin removes her professional mask, literally, a small gesture of pulling off her reading glasses and setting them on the desk, then reaches for the mason jar hidden in her bottom drawer. Inside, moth wings flutter weakly against the glass, collected over months of sleepless nights when her clients' traumas replay in her mind like broken records. In the symbolic realm of absorbed suffering, Sarah has built a vast library where books write themselves. The shelves stretch impossibly high, filled with volumes that bear other people's names but somehow tell her story. Each book pulses with borrowed pain. The combat veteran's nightmares now disturbing her sleep. The abuse survivor's hypervigilance now scanning her own empty home for threats. The grieving mother's tears now falling from her eyes during grocery store visits when she passes the baby food aisle. The architecture of this library defies physics. Rooms expand to accommodate new acquisitions. Corridors stretch longer with each client she accepts, and windows look out not onto the world, but into other people's memories. White rose petals, remnants from Elena's cathedral, drift through the air like snow, settling on book spines and dissolving into nothing, while discarded masks from Marcus's Shadow Museum lie scattered between the stacks, stepped over but never picked up. Sarah moves through this space as both librarian and living archive, her body a repository for emotions that were never hers to hold. She has learned the dangerous alchemy of empathy, how to transform her own emotional stability into temporary relief for others, how to metabolize the trauma like a human filtration system, how to carry poison in her bloodstream and call it compassion. The moth in the jar watches her with compound eyes that reflect not her face, but the faces of everyone she has tried to save. The other collectors visit this library regularly. Nurses who absorb their patients' fear, teachers who carry their students' home lives in their chest, friends who become professional listeners, parents who swallow their children's anxiety to keep them safe. They move through the stacks like ghosts of themselves, their original personalities slowly dissolving into the needs of others, until they become echo chambers of everyone else's emotional weather, barometers that measure atmospheric pressure in other people's hearts. But Schopenhauer would recognize this library as another temple to the will, disguised as altruism. Sarah believes she is healing others. The will knows she is systematically destroying herself. Her capacity for empathy, which began as a gift, has become the mechanism of her own dissolution. She has confused absorbing pain with alleviating it, not understanding that pain cannot be destroyed, only moved from one vessel to another. The revelation comes when Sarah opens a book with her own name on the cover, expecting to find her story, only to discover blank pages. She has given away so much of herself that no authentic self remains, just a sophisticated collection of other people's emotional experiences, curated with the precision of a museum exhibit dedicated to suffering that was never hers to begin with. The moth in the jar finally stops moving, and she realizes it was never a moth at all, but the last fragment of who she used to be before she learned to love others more than she loved herself. The healers called it sacred duty. Today, psychology names it emotional enmeshment, the pathological absorption of others' emotional states to the point where boundaries between self and other dissolve entirely. Identified in family systems therapy, enmeshment manifests in our modern world through the helper who cannot stop helping, the empath who absorbs every room's emotional temperature, the endless cycle of giving that leaves the giver depleted while creating dependency in those they seek to help. We see it in the parent who lives vicariously through their child's achievements, the friend who becomes a therapist to everyone but themselves, the professional caregiver who brings every client's trauma home. Through Schopenhauer's lens, emotional enmeshment becomes the will's most seductive trap, convincing us that self-sacrifice is spiritually noble when it actually perpetuates the cycle of suffering by preventing both helper and helped from developing authentic resilience. Schopenhauer would see Sarah's library as the will's reading room, where she believes she is reducing the world's pain when she is actually concentrating it, becoming a black hole of suffering that grows stronger with each act of supposed compassion. The will doesn't need to create martyrs when it can convince good people to martyr themselves in service of others' wounds. The insidious beauty of this trap is that it feels like love, like purpose, like spiritual awakening. The helper experiences the rush of being needed, the validation of being essential, the intoxicating belief that their suffering serves a higher purpose. They never see that they have become emotional vampires, feeding on others' pain, not to heal it, but to avoid confronting the emptiness where their own authentic self should live. When you enter a room full of people, do you immediately scan for who needs saving? How many jars of other people's pain are you carrying? And what happened to the person you were before you learned to transform yourself into a receptacle for the world's wounds? The most dangerous healers are those who have forgotten they, too, need healing. Two people lie in bed together, each dreaming of someone else, trapped in a partnership that has become a museum of what they used to feel for each other. Amanda and David perform their morning ritual, coffee and matching mugs, a kiss that lands somewhere between cheek and air. Have a good day, spoken with the mechanical precision of actors who have forgotten why they auditioned for these roles in the first place. In the symbolic landscape of dead intimacy, they inhabit a house where every room contains the fossilized remains of their former love. The bedroom holds the ghost of passion, transparent and untouchable, moving through the space like a memory that refuses to fully fade. The kitchen displays their conversations, preserved in amber, the same exchanges about schedules and groceries and weekend plans, polished smooth by repetition until they gleam like museum pieces. They navigate around these artifacts carefully, two curators in a relationship that has become an exhibition of what connection used to look like. The architecture of this house defies emotional logic. Rooms that once pulsed with intimacy now echo with the hollow sound of obligation. Rose petals from Elena's cathedral have wilted into potpourri that decorates their dining table, beautiful from a distance, but brittle to the touch. Marcus's discarded masks hang on hooks by the front door, his and hers worn automatically before facing the world that believes they are still in love. Sarah's mason jars line the windowsills, each containing the preserved remains of emotions they once felt but can no longer access. Amanda builds her cage from gratitude. He's a good man, stable, reliable, the kind of partner her therapist says she should want. The bars are forged from shared mortgages and mutual friends, from the story everyone tells about how perfect they are together, from her mother's relief that she finally found someone who won't break her heart. She decorates her cage with compromise, hanging curtains made of small sacrifices, arranging furniture that prioritizes harmony over desire. David constructs his prison from responsibility. She needs him, depends on him, has built her life around their life together. His walls are made of her vulnerability, mortared with guilt about the restlessness he feels but cannot name. He has learned to mistake emotional caretaking for love, to confuse being needed with being wanted, to feed his starving heart on the thin gruel of appreciation when what he craves is the feast of being chosen. Daily, desperately, completely, they meet in the space between their cages, a DMZ of domestic routine where they exchange pleasantries and coordinate schedules while carefully avoiding the landmines of what they actually feel. Schopenhauer would see this arrangement as the will's masterpiece of efficiency. Two people generating maximum suffering while maintaining minimum awareness of their condition, like hamsters on wheels who have convinced themselves they are marathon runners. The other cage dwellers visit regularly, couples who recognize the familiar choreography, friends who perform the same dance of emotional avoidance, family members who have forgotten that partnership can be more than parallel loneliness. They gather for dinner parties where conversations hover safely in the shallows of shared references and familiar complaints, everyone participating in the collective delusion that this is what mature love looks like. The revelation comes during a power outage when Amanda and David sit in darkness, finally unable to perform their usual routines. Without the familiar props and scripts, they discover they have nothing to say to each other, not because they have said everything, but because they have been saying nothing for so long they have forgotten how to speak their own emotional language. In the candlelight, they see each other clearly for the first time in years. Two strangers who share a bed, a mortgage, and a story that everyone else believes, but they can no longer remember how to feel. The Romantics called it settling down. Today, psychology names it emotional avoidance, the unconscious conspiracy between partners to maintain surface harmony while systematically avoiding authentic intimacy, vulnerability, or growth. Identified in attachment theory research, this pattern manifests in our modern world through relationships that function like well-oiled machines but provide no nourishment for the soul. Couples who can coordinate complex logistics while remaining emotional strangers, and the epidemic of loneliness within partnership that therapists see in their offices daily. We witness it in marriages that survive on routine rather than connection, in partnerships where both people are quietly grieving the love they thought they had found. Through Schopenhauer's philosophical framework, emotional avoidance becomes the will's most efficient torture device, keeping people together while ensuring they remain fundamentally isolated, creating the suffering of connection without intimacy, the pain of being known but not seen. Schopenhauer would recognize Amanda and David's house as the will's perfect prison, where the inmates volunteer to be guards, where the suffering is so normalized it becomes invisible, where love dies so slowly that no one notices it's gone until they're already grieving its ghost. The genius of this trap lies in its social acceptability. Everyone celebrates the couple that never fights, admires the partnership that runs smoothly, envies the relationship that looks so stable from the outside. The will doesn't need to create dramatic chaos when it can convince people that emotional numbness is spiritual maturity, that avoiding conflict is the same as creating harmony. In the quiet spaces between your words and your partners, what are you both carefully not saying? What intimacy are you avoiding to maintain the peace? And what price are you paying for a connection that demands so little of your authentic self? Love that requires no risk, offers no reward. A woman stands at her bathroom mirror at 3 a.m., practicing the words. She will never have the courage to speak, trapped in the prophetic loop of her own self-fulfilling limitations. Rachel rehearses her resignation speech for the 100th time, each word polished to perfection, each pause calculated for maximum impact. But even as she speaks to her reflection, she knows she will arrive at work tomorrow and smile at her boss, accept another impossible deadline, swallow another small humiliation with the grace of someone who has learned to feast on her own diminishment. In the symbolic realm of learned helplessness, Rachel inhabits a vast theater where she is simultaneously playwright, director, actor, and audience, but never the protagonist of her own story. The stage is littered with scripts she has written but never performed, conversations with her mother about boundaries, emails to toxic friends explaining why she can't continue the friendship, applications for jobs that would challenge her, love letters to herself, acknowledging her worth. The curtain rises and falls on the same play every day. The woman who almost spoke up. The theater's architecture is built from discarded opportunities, jobs not applied for, relationships not pursued, truths not spoken, dreams not chased. Rose petals from Elena's cathedral carpet the aisles, each one representing a moment when Rachel chose longing over action, Masks from Marcus's museum hang in the dressing rooms, worn by understudies who play the roles Rachel refuses to claim for herself. Sarah's moths flutter through the rafters, no longer confined to jars, but free to spread the disease of self-sacrifice that Rachel has learned to call humility. In the orchestra pit sits a clock with no hands. Time becomes irrelevant when you spend your life waiting for permission that will never come, for courage that you refuse to cultivate, for the perfect moment that exists only in the gap between intention and action. The clock's face reflects not hours or minutes, but the accumulating weight of chosen powerlessness, each tick marking another opportunity transformed into an excuse. Rachel has become a virtuoso of almost brave enough to speak her truth, almost strong enough to leave the relationship that diminishes her, almost wise enough to stop seeking validation from people who are incapable of seeing her worth. She curates her collection of almosts with the precision of a museum curator, polishing each near miss until it gleams with the false nobility of martyrdom. The other understudies visit this theater regularly. People who have confused self-awareness with self-actualization, who can diagnose their patterns with therapeutic precision, but somehow remain powerless to change them. They gather in the lobby during intermissions, discussing their insights with the enthusiasm of scholars studying a foreign language they will never learn to speak fluently. Together, they sustain the economy of perpetual preparation, each person's paralysis reinforcing the other's belief that understanding is enough, that awareness equals action, that talking about change is the same as changing. Schopenhauer would recognize this theater as the will's cruelest joke, giving humans the capacity to see their cages clearly while removing their ability to find the keys. Rachel's prophetic powers are real, but they serve only to fulfill her own defeats. She can predict with startling accuracy how every situation will unfold, but her predictions become prescriptions, her insights become prisons, her self-awareness becomes another form of self-sabotage. The revelation comes when Rachel realizes that her bathroom mirror is not reflecting her face, but the face of every woman who came before her. Her mother, who dreamed of being an artist but became a secretary. Her grandmother, who wanted to travel but never left her hometown. Generations of women who practiced courage in private and performed submission in public. She has inherited not just their DNA, but their patterns of self-limitation, their strategies for survival that became strategies for slow-motion suicide. The philosophers called it fate. Today, psychology names it learned helplessness, the psychological condition where individuals, after experiencing repeated trauma or failure, begin to believe they have no control over their situation and stop trying to change it, even when change becomes possible. Discovered by Martin Seligman in his experiments with dogs, learned helplessness manifests in our modern world through the employee who endures workplace abuse, the partner who stays in relationships that diminish them, the endless cycle of self-awareness without self-advocacy that therapy culture has sometimes encouraged. We see it in people who can analyze their trauma with doctoral-level precision while remaining emotionally frozen in patterns that no longer serve them. Through Schopenhauer's lens, learned helplessness becomes the will's most sophisticated prison, one where the inmates hold the keys but have been convinced they are decorative objects. Schopenhauer would see Rachel's theater as the will's amphitheater, where she performs her powerlessness for an audience that includes only herself, creating suffering through the illusion of insight without action. The will doesn't need to break people when it can convince them they are already broken, doesn't need to imprison them when it can teach them to build their own selves with the materials of self-knowledge. The terrible beauty of this trap is that it feels like wisdom, like depth, like spiritual sophistication. The helpless person experiences the satisfaction of understanding their condition, the validation of being seen as insightful, the comfortable familiarity of problems that never require solutions. They mistake the ability to describe their cage for the power to open it, confuse awareness with agency, transform self-knowledge into another form of self-indulgence. What truths are you practicing in private that you refuse to perform in public? How many dress rehearsals will you attend for a life you're too afraid to actually live? The most perfect preparation for a life never lived is understanding exactly why you're not living it.